Throughout the original timeline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, from Iron Man in 2008 to Avengers Endgame in 2019, Captain America had many appearances as well as many situations where he fought either by himself or with the Howling Commandos through Europe, different United States Army battalions against the Nazis, with his best friend James Buchanan, Bucky Barnes, or even the Avengers. But the speculative scenario is this: what sort of fighting style did Captain America use in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? In the comics, due to Steve Rogers' childhood and upbringing based on circumstances, he originally had a sort of street fighting that was known by most boys in New York City throughout the late 1800s to roughly the 1950s. The Irish and Italians made this sort of street fighting known throughout the city and was fairly based on actual techniques of the conditions that they would find themselves in when they were in a confrontational situation with someone else. This was mentioned in passing when Steve got into a fight in the alley and Bucky had to step in to help Steve in the first Avenger. In the comics, Steve was known for his skills as a fighter in boxing. This was before he learned all of the different sorts of techniques that he would later acquire and improvise during all that he had done in his life. It was a sort of boxing, but it was taken from the real life inspired bare knuckle boxing that the English and Irish were known for using in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In the movies, there were no real explanations for Steve's fighting methods, but by the time he had entered service with the United States Armed Forces, he was clearly trained in hand-to-hand combat on how to deal with an opponent in close quarters. Also, due to those facts, it's a canonical statement that Cap's original style of combat is American boxing with the 1940s United States Army philosophy. This was displayed with his iconic boxing scene showing that he clearly had honed skills, which were enhanced by the super soldier serum that he was given. From after the first Avenger to Endgame, Steve improvised and modified his fighting techniques to incorporate different aspects of attacking, defense, or support, all of which were dependent on the situation that he was in, using the boxing techniques as his fundamental philosophy of combat, which was easy to observe whenever he was in a fight. He essentially had to modernize his method of fighting due to his background being that of the said American Army boxing techniques from the early 1940s to fighting in the early to mid 21st century, nearly 100 years later. With everything of the time, he had come a long way from his youth in New York City in the early 20th century with only improvised experience to a trained soldier during the Second World War, to a superhuman that's acquired different moves from an international and even interplanetary point of view. In the comics, there were actually data presented at different times throughout the stories as to how strong the captain's punches were, or the lethal aspects of his attacks. There were countless examples of his strength on display that were either calculated, theorized, or assumed from the equally countless feats that Steve Rogers performed in the comics. In the films, there were no real gauges of strength to let the viewers of the movies to know just how powerful, devastating, or even lethal Captain America's punches or even strikes were, due to the varying circumstances that he was depicted in, with relation only to opponents or threats. The boxing scene was technically the only real example in the original era of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that Steve's strength could have been calculated or even theorized from. Sources had varying impacts or strength levels depending on the punch intensity, velocity from the impact, or the strength of movement with the strike. But again, due to a lack of official statistics from the original era of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, only speculations can be summarized due to the lack of any real data.